Well, as some of you know, I grew up in a small town in Idaho. Now, during the summer following my first year of seminary, I returned to my home church, Boone Memorial Presbyterian Church in Caldwell, Idaho, as the summer intern. Somebody have a Kleenex? Oh, well, thank you, Janet. Okay. I was the summer intern. The idea was to get an exposure to the whole spectrum of ministry, and so I planned the ice cream social, which we had every summer. I attended church camp at Camp Sawtooth, the camp I'd gone to as a child, as a counselor. Oh, a whole box, thank you. All right. Visited the shut-ins, of course, and taught Bible study, and I preached. I remember visiting with my former Sunday school teacher in a local nursing home that summer. Her name was Maud Hannah. She had faithfully taught the elementary age Sunday school, probably from the beginning of time. She was a great teacher and a very faithful disciple. It was sad to see her trapped in one of those awful adjustable hospital beds by ill health, but there was nothing wrong with her spirit. We'd been talking for some time when out of the blue she asked me if I'd studied the virgin birth in seminary yet. Well, this was the enlightened late 1970s, and most everyone at SFTS seemed to know that virgin births were a dime a dozen. Now, this had come as news to me, fresh off the farm in Idaho as I was. Now, there had been several conversations with what was a bumper crop of women in seminary about the true meaning of the word virgin. We eventually concluded that it really meant a woman unto herself, a whole woman, a soul mother, if you will. Now, this was a radical shift, at least for me, from thinking of a virgin as what a woman is until made complete by a man. Well, I waxed eloquent for several minutes, dumping all of my newfound knowledge all over poor Maud. When I stopped, she smiled at me and said she thought it was always so special to belong to a family of folks who could believe and hold as a core tenet something as preposterous and yet as engaging as the story of the birth of Jesus. Maud had once again trimmed my sails. She did that several times over in the course of our, have you ever seen a trimmed sail? There you go. All right. Now, it was relating my encounter with Maud and the virgin birth that got me through my trials for ordination 3 years later on the floor of Boise Presbytery. And trust me, that's exactly what Boise Presbytery looks like. The first question I was asked was, do you believe in the virgin birth? Now, Maud was there at my trials for ordination in a wheelchair to support me, and she was a bit embarrassed that I had told them of our conversation, but she was thrilled to have one of her kids go into the ministry. She had told me that summer that of all of her students, she thought I had what it would take to be a pastor. In her 90-plus years, she had experienced plenty of ministers, and she was quite sure that some of them were not cut from what she would have called the right cloth. She said that she liked the ones who were willing to work for a higher righteousness. I still remember her use of that phrase. Now, Maud did not live long enough to see me go into ministry with prostituted women and their children in this very presbytery, but she would have approved, I'm sure. You recognize the fellowship hall? This was an annual meeting that the Mary Magdalene Project held here, probably in the 90s, I'm guessing. Yeah. And so, in our text for the fourth Sunday in Advent, Joseph discovers that Mary has indeed been unfaithful to him, or at least it must have seemed that way. We read this story from Matthew and imagine the tension and stress between Joseph and Mary, plunged into circumstances not of their own making, but that impact them totally. As we read the story, we can think of many friends and family members who we know who are wrestling to make sense of impossible, uncontrollable, and inexplicable experiences. We read this story and remember people of faith, just, upright, fair, righteous children of God who, in the face of difficult relationships, heartbreaking news, or tragic events, respond with grace and mercy and love, when lesser reactions would have been more than justified. We are invited as we read this story to remember that God may well do something salvific through some of life's most chaotic happenings. Now, part of what makes Joseph righteous is his willingness to set aside his own upright plans and embrace the strange message from God that appears to run counter to the previous divine commands. The radical part of this story is that we often miss amidst pageants and poinsettias is Joseph's decision to jettison what he fervently believed was right and the faithful thing to do, and instead step into a new thing that God was doing. This only foreshadows what will come. Jesus will eat with sinners. He will heal on the Sabbath. Gentiles will be engrafted into what had traditionally been only a Hebrew covenant. Jews and Gentiles will eat at the same table. God will continue to upend expectations and do so through unlikely people in ways the self-righteous will find offensive. Now, Mary became pregnant before her marriage to Joseph, but while betrothed to him in what would have been considered at the time a legally binding relationship, as indicated by the fact that the text actually refers to him as her husband, even though they are not yet married. Our story about Mary this morning follows 18 steamy verses about the DNA or the genealogy of Jesus. Now, how many of you have done the 23andMe or the Ancestry DNA thing? Did you find any surprises? Anything unusual? You can imagine I'm 98% Northern European. Yes, and there were no surprises there. Well, the lineage of Jesus is replete with no other than two prostitutes, Tamar and Rahab, Ruth the Moabite, who married Boaz after placing him in a rather compromising position one night on a threshing room floor, Bathsheba, who committed adultery with David, assuming that it was indeed consensual sex, and Mary, an out-of-wedlock teenager. Pretty impressive, huh? Certainly an interesting start for a future Messiah and King, isn't it? Now, nowhere in Scripture is this lineage discussed beyond the individual stories of these women. No gospel author asks probing questions, and no writer of an epistle calls into question why these are the women chosen by Matthew for the lineage of Jesus, and the only women included in Matthew's version of Jesus' family tree. It's not clear that these women are deemed bad or sinful. Sexuality in Matthew's time is not automatically equated with sin. No other sources, either Jewish or Christian, from this period in time regard these women necessarily as sinners. Now, Rahab and Ruth were not Jews, which some scholars interpret as a welcoming of Gentiles into the early church. In early Jewish tradition, both Rahab and Tamar were considered proselytes, and Tamar and Bathsheba are considered by most biblical scholars to have been Hebrews. Even though these women appear to have been of questionable stature, I believe they symbolize a higher righteousness. Tamar acted in what I would call a quintessential survival move when Judah unjustly, and some would say stupidly, refused to. Rahab recognized the power of the Hebrew God and so protected the scouts, and Ruth followed the advice of her mother-in-law, proving herself to be better than most Jews. None of these women had 1 ounce of personal power, and yet they made a totally unexpected and, I would say, tremendous impact on biblical history and served as examples of divine purpose, much like Jesus did. Mary is presented as being passive in our story this morning. Joseph is the model of higher righteousness. Like the unconventional figures in the genealogy, he does what is considered proper, even though his actions are not considered legally necessary, nor are they even socially expected. By accepting the pregnant Mary and resolving to divorce her quietly, he spared her accusations of adultery or rape. By naming the baby, he socially legitimates both mother and son. Jesus becomes Joseph's legitimate son through adoption. Now, most of you can recite the birth narrative of Jesus for memory. At least you can hit the highlights, right? It would be probably the account from Luke. And yet, every Advent season, we wait for him. We do this all again. We anticipate his arrival not just as an historical event, but as part of our own stories here and now. Jesus reveals himself to others through us. In fact, we are the only Jesus most people will ever meet. Think about that. We are the only Jesus most people will ever meet. We are the innocent baby, the young virgin, the confused Joseph, the wise ones, the shepherds. We are the source of others knowing Emmanuel, God with us. As Christians, we live as the Advent candles proclaim, in joy, not despair, in hope, not cynicism, in peace and love, not fear. Emmanuel means God with us, God in us, God through us, God for us, God for this suffering world. We greet the dawn of God's truth as we celebrate the anticipated birth of Emmanuel, but also as we welcome through baptism little Emma and Mar Rydbeck. This very morning, it is always good when we can receive children into our church family through the wonderful sacrament of baptism. I believe it is through this sacrament that we act as the community of new possibilities. We are embracing a higher righteousness, fulfilling the promise of Emmanuel. As we joyfully anticipate the new life which will spring forth in the birth of Jesus, we will welcome and love little Emma. It will be our responsibility to help her know and come to love Jesus. Joseph and Mary show us a faithful response to the present and coming realm of God. Righteousness entails humility, the willingness to set aside deeply held assumptions, the ability to abandon our own plans and step into God's sometimes disturbing, dizzying new thing, the strength to take a stand and make a choice that runs counter to common wisdom or cultural norms or even religious rules. And we Presbyterians love our rules. The courage to imagine that God is at work even when we are reeling from the loss of what had been our hoped for future. Mary could have said no to God. Joseph could have ignored the angel's instructions, but they didn't. God, no doubt, would not have been thwarted by any of this, and Jesus would still have been born. God's ways are not our ways, and God's hopes and imagination far exceed our own. In the end, it's about our willingness to take risks, to say yes to what God has indeed promised to us. May it be so. Amen.